One ordinary morning at Mrs. Thompson's farm, her mare Bella started showing strange signs of labor. But there was one thing that didn't add up. Bella had never shown any signs of being pregnant. When Mrs. Thompson checked the security cameras, what she saw made her blood run cold. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. This can't be real, she whispered, her heart pounding. What's going on with Bella? Mrs. Thompson asked, her eyes fixed on the mare as she paced restlessly around the pen. Her chest heaved with each labored breath, nostrils flaring as sharp snorts cut through the serene morning air. There was something unsettling in her gaze that the older woman couldn't ignore. This isn't like any other morning, she thought. It was spring, and the soft sunlight was just beginning to peek through the windows of the Thompson family barn, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Bella, the sleek black mare they'd taken in a few years ago, had always been a gentle, even-tempered creature. She preferred the company of people over the hard work of the fields. But today, something was off. Her movements were erratic, almost frantic, and a light sheen of sweat glistened on her coat, a clear sign she hadn't slept well. Mrs. Thompson approached the corral, lifting a hand to stroke Bella's silken mane. "Easy there, girl," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Everything's going to be fine." Yet deep down, worry gnawed at her. She had seen signs like this in other animals over the years, but never in Bella. The mare had shown no indications of pregnancy, no behavioral shifts, no swelling, no weight gain that might suggest a foal was on the way. And yet here she was, acting as if some profound change was imminent. The realization struck her that she couldn't wait any longer. With steady hands, she reached for her cell phone, a device she didn't fully understand but had learned to use for emergencies, and dialed the number of the town's trusted veterinarian, Dr. Carter. "Doctor, it's me, Mrs. Thompson," she said, a tone calm but betraying an edge of urgency. "Something's wrong with Bella. Could you come to the farm? It might be serious." Dr. Carter arrived in no time. He was an older man with steady hands and a deliberate, calming voice that always seemed to put people at ease. He had seen Bella many times before during routine checkups and knew her as a healthy, resilient animal. But the moment he stepped into the barn and saw her, his brow furrowed with concern. "You say she started acting this way this morning?" he asked, crouching to examine the mare more closely. "Since last night, but it's worse today," Mrs. Thompson replied, the anxiety in her voice more evident now. "She's restless, and I'm worried that, well, something's happening." She hesitated to finish the thought aloud, as the idea of Bella being in labor without any prior signs seemed implausible. Still, every instinct told her it was possible. But how? There hadn't been another horse for miles around. Dr. Carter checked Bella's vitals in silence before turning to Mrs. Thompson with a grave expression. "It looks like she's going into labor," he finally said, his words hitting her like a stone in the gut. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll prepare for complications just in case. We need to be ready." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her shock leaving her momentarily speechless. How could this be happening? Bella had never left the farm, and everyone in the town knew they didn't own a stallion. Something didn't add up, and the unease lingered as she watched the doctor gather instruments and arrange the barn for what was apparently about to unfold. Night fell, but the tension in the air was almost tangible. Mrs. Thompson couldn't sit still. The faint starlight barely illuminated the barn, but she felt the weight of mystery pressing in on her, as if the shadows themselves whispered secrets she was desperate to uncover. With nerves battling determination, she decided she couldn't let another moment pass. Questions swirled in her mind, and there was only one way to find answers. "I'm checking the cameras," she declared, making her way toward the small office in the shed. Her husband gave her a look of doubt, but didn't argue. He knew better than to stand in her way once she'd made up her mind. With purposeful strides, Mrs. Thompson entered the room and switched on the monitor. It flickered briefly before coming to life, the grainy images slowly loading onto the screen. As she waited, her thoughts raced through the countless possibilities. Bella had never been close to a stallion, or so she believed. Memories of how she had always been kept apart from other mares and stallions to avoid any risks now seemed to mock her. How, then, could she be on the verge of giving birth? As the scenes of the past few days replayed in her mind, a gnawing feeling in her stomach hinted that she was about to uncover something deeply unsettling. And then she saw it. Her heart skipped a beat. It had happened nearly 2 months ago on a quiet night when everyone was fast asleep. The cameras had captured a figure moving stealthily near Bella's pen. At first it was just a shadow, a vague silhouette slipping cautiously through the gate. But then the faint lights of the stable revealed more. The figure of a woman appeared, gently pushing the door open just enough to let a horse through. Mrs. Thompson leaned closer to the screen, her eyes fixed on every movement. She watched as the horse, unmistakably a stallion, crossed the threshold and headed straight for Bella. Her breathing quickened. That moment, seemingly mundane, struck her as a betrayal of trust. "Who would dare do something like this without telling us?" she muttered under her breath. Rewinding the video, she paused it at a clearer shot of the stallion. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition set in. "Storm!" she exclaimed, the name slipping from her lips. She knew the horse instantly. It was Henry's prized stallion, a neighbor she had known all her life. Henry was a good man, always kind and willing to lend a hand. But if that were true, why had this happened? And more importantly, who was the woman who had led Storm into Bella's pen? One thing was certain, it hadn't been Henry. With her heart pounding, Mrs. Thompson left the shed and found her husband waiting nearby. "I've discovered something," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. "We need to talk to Dr. Carter." Her mind whirled with questions that quickly morphed into suspicion. Why had someone brought Storm to Bella without their consent? And what might this mean for the mare and the foal she now carried? As dawn broke, the soft hues of pink and orange painted the horizon, but Mrs. Thompson felt none of the serenity of the morning. She had barely slept, her restless dreams haunted by unanswered questions. Rising early, she made her way to the stable. Bella was still there in her pen, but something was different. The mare paced back and forth, her movements restless, as if seeking comfort in the rhythm of her steps. Mrs. Thompson approached slowly, her heart heavy. She reached out to stroke Bella's neck, her touch gentle, but her voice trembling. "Easy now, my sweet girl. Everything's going to be okay," she whispered, though the anxiety laced in her words betrayed her attempt at reassurance. It wasn't long before Dr. Carter arrived. His expression, more serious than usual, only added to the weight pressing on Mrs. Thompson's chest. "How's she doing?" he asked, his medical bag in hand as he stepped closer to the pen. "She won't stop pacing, and I think the contractions are getting stronger," she admitted, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't know what to do." Despite years of caring for Bella, she had never faced anything like this, and the discovery on the camera footage lingered in her thoughts, like a shadow refusing to fade. Dr. Carter began his examination, his movements slow and deliberate as he checked Bella's breathing and palpated her swollen abdomen. His furrowed brow and the tightening of his jaw revealed more than he said aloud. After several tense minutes, he looked up, his tone grave, but steady. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to act quickly. The foal is in a bad position. If we don't turn it, there could be serious complications." His words hit her like a blow, momentarily stealing her breath. "But can it be done?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm, even as fear welled inside her. "Yes, but it won't be easy. I'll need help to try repositioning the foal. If we can't manage, it could endanger Bella's life," he explained, his tone leaving no room for doubt. There was no time to waste. The urgency in his voice spurred her into action. Mr. Thompson, who had been standing silently at the barn door, stepped inside to assist. "Tell me what to do, doctor," he said, his voice steady, though a faint edge of fear lingered beneath his calm demeanor. In the next few moments, the barn became a whirlwind of motion and hushed encouragements as Dr. Carter and Mr. Thompson worked side by side, following each instruction with precise care. Mrs. Thompson knelt by Bella's head, stroking the mare's mane with tender hands, her voice soft and soothing. "You're going to be okay, girl. We're here with you," she whispered repeatedly, as if willing her words to manifest a miracle. Yet deep inside her, thoughts kept circling back to the haunting images from the surveillance cameras. The woman who had mysteriously led Storm into the paddock without permission. So many unanswered questions loomed in her mind, and while she knew saving Bella was all that mattered now, she couldn't shake the sense that everything was somehow connected. Minutes passed, like hours. Then finally Dr. Carter leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've managed to turn it," he announced, allowing a faint smile to soften his typically stern expression. "Now we just have to hope Bella can do the rest." Relief swept briefly through the air, but it was fleeting. The contractions returned with a brutal intensity, each one more grueling than the last. Bella snorted and trembled, her hooves striking the floor in a desperate rhythm that wrenched at their hearts. Mrs. Thompson stayed at her side, holding the mare close, whispering reassurances even as her own hands quaked with fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp, piercing whinny echoed through the barn. Bella made one final agonizing push, and the foal was born. It was small, frail, slick with fluid, and barely moving, but it was alive. For a brief moment, the world stood still as everyone held their breath, watching to see if it would move, if it would take its first breath. And then it did. The tiny foal shifted its legs, attempting to rise, and let out a soft, weak sound. Tears streamed down Mrs. Thompson's face as relief washed over her. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you, my girl." But the joy was short-lived. As Dr. Carter approached to examine the newborn, his expression shifted, his brows knitting together in concern. There was something off, something unusual about the foal. "This isn't normal," he murmured, his voice heavy with unease. He turned to Mrs. Thompson, who was still dabbing tears from her cheeks. The foal, still wobbly and covered in straw, struggled to stand. Its awkward, trembling movements betrayed a strange distortion in its posture. Its limbs seemed to bend unnaturally, its delicate body curving in ways that didn't seem right. Dr. Carter studied it with the intensity of a man searching for answers amid chaos, while Mrs. Thompson could only see a fragile creature that had fought so hard to be born, now seemingly paying a heavy price for that fight. "Doctor, what's wrong?" she asked, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the barn. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as though she feared her words might somehow disturb the foal. "What's wrong with him?" Dr. Carter straightened, letting out a deep sigh as he wiped his hands on a handkerchief pulled from his pocket. "I can't say for certain, Mrs. Thompson," he began carefully, "but there are signs that worry me. His joints don't appear to be fully developed, and his spine, there's something strange about its curvature." He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the struggling foal. It could be a genetic deformity, or it might have something to do with how he was conceived. Those last words sent a chill down Mrs. Thompson's spine. How he was conceived? She repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief, though deep down she knew exactly what he meant. Her mind raced back to the security footage, to the shadowy figure leading Storm into Bella's paddock under the cover of night. A new urgency surged within her, eclipsing her fear. "We can't leave it like this, doctor," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling inside her. "We have to find out the truth. I need to know who did this, why it happened, and if Storm is involved. We need answers from Henry." The next day, the Thompsons prepared for what they knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. The morning air was crisp despite the sun hanging high in the sky. Mrs. Thompson had put on her finest coat, not to impress but to feel shielded, as if the thick fabric could protect her from the harsh words that lay ahead. Henry met them on his porch, his face clouded with confusion. Mr. Thompson had called him early that morning, the tone of the conversation making it clear something was amiss. "Good morning, Henry," Mr. Thompson greeted him, his usual light-hearted demeanor replaced with a rare seriousness. "We need to discuss something we've discovered." Henry gestured for them to step inside, but Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "We'd rather stay out here if that's all right with you," she said firmly. She didn't want to be confined by walls when the storm she sensed was brewing finally broke. "What's this about?" Henry asked, his unease evident. Mrs. Thompson took a steadying breath before speaking. "We've had an unusual situation with Bella. Last night when she gave birth, Dr. Carter noticed something odd about the foal, so we checked the security cameras. We saw Storm, your horse, in our corral. Can you explain that?" Henry blinked in disbelief. Storm? No, I had no idea. He's in the stable every night. I've never noticed him gone. He paused, a flicker of realization crossing his face. But lately, Emily's been acting strange. I didn't want to mention it until I was sure. But maybe we should talk to her. Mrs. Thompson felt a tightening in her chest. She had hoped Henry would deny everything outright, that he would insist Storm had never left his stall. But the mention of Emily, Henry's daughter, always so kind and reserved, unnerved her. Then it's best we clear this up now, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Call Emily, we need answers. Henry disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later with Emily by his side. The young woman looked visibly uneasy, her shoulders stiff and her gaze fixed on the ground. Mrs. Thompson noticed she couldn't meet the eyes of either her father or the Thompsons, a detail that spoke volumes. Emily stood before them, her posture slumped as if carrying an unbearable weight. Mrs. Thompson studied her closely, searching for any trace of remorse or honesty in her demeanor. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them. On the porch, the silence felt oppressive, nearly suffocating. Explain to me what happened, Mrs. Thompson finally said, her voice firm yet carefully controlled, betraying the effort it took to remain composed. Why did you bring Storm to Bella's corral without telling us? Emily's eyes flicked up for just a moment, catching the stern faces of the Thompsons and the worry etched into her father's expression. She bit her lip, searching for the right words, though she knew no explanation would undo what she had done. I thought I was doing something good, she began, her voice barely a whisper. My family, we've been going through a tough time financially. When I found out how valuable Storm was, I thought that if Bella had a foal by him, we could sell it. The money would really help us. Her words spilled out slowly, each one heavier than the last. Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of anger rising within her, a flood threatening to break its dam. She had dedicated her life to caring for Bella, ensuring the mare lived a peaceful, dignified life. The idea that someone would exploit her horse for selfish gain churned her stomach. And you thought that was all right? Mrs. Thompson demanded, her voice now tinged with disbelief and simmering rage. You thought you could take Storm in the dead of night, carry out your plan, and no one would notice. She took a step closer, her words cutting through the cold morning air. Bella isn't just an animal to us, she's family. Emily shivered at the harsh tone of Mrs. Thompson's voice, yet this time she didn't avert her gaze. I know, and I'm not trying to excuse what I did, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake, and I regret it deeply. I just wanted to help my dad and myself. I never thought things would spiral out of control like this. Henry, who had been silent until now, turned to his daughter with a mix of sorrow and bewilderment etched across his face. Why did, he asked, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. If you needed help, you should have come to me. You can't make decisions like this without thinking about the consequences. Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks, and in that moment, she looked smaller, like a child overwhelmed by a mistake far too big to comprehend. I didn't want to burden you more, she said, wiping her tears with her sleeve. All I wanted was to find a solution. But now I see I only made things worse. Mrs. Thompson drew a deep breath, striving to remain calm even as her thoughts raced. She had expected answers, but Emily's confession had only brought more questions and complications. She wasn't sure how to handle the weight of what she'd just learned. The one thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't let this slide. Bella and the foal deserved better. I'm sorry you're dealing with difficulties, Emily. I truly am, she said, her voice softening, though the anger still flickered in her eyes. But that doesn't justify what you did. You had no right to make decisions about Bella, especially not in this way. Emily nodded, absorbing the words like a punishment she knew she deserved. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, to help the foal and Bella, she offered, though her voice was frail and broken. Mrs. Thompson closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm within before she spoke again. A swirl of emotions churned in her heart. Anger at the betrayal, sorrow over the situation, and a faint glimmer of empathy for Emily, who had clearly gotten herself into something far beyond her depth. I don't know if there's anything you can do to fix this, she finally said, opening her eyes to meet Emily's. "What I do know is that I don't want to see you near Bella or our ranch again. This has already been painful enough for everyone, and I believe the best thing is for you to stay away." The words fell like a verdict, and the anguish on Emily's face was unmistakable. Yet she didn't argue or beg. She simply nodded, accepting Mrs. Thompson's decision, knowing her own choices had led her to this moment. "I understand," she murmured, her eyes turning to her father. "Dad, I'm sorry. I never wanted things to end like this." After the tense confrontation with Emily, Mrs. Thompson returned to the ranch with a lighter chest, but a sadness that clung to her heart like a thorn. It had been hard to tell the young woman not to come back, but she knew it was necessary. She had to protect Bella and the fragile little foal born into a world of chaos and heartbreak. Now, with Emily gone, the Thompson family could focus on what mattered most, caring for their animals and ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. By the time Mrs. Thompson reached the barn, night had fallen. The air was still, broken only by the soft sighs of the mares and the faint rustling of the wind slipping through the wooden slats. Bella lay resting, her golden coat gleaming faintly under the dim light, recovering from everything she had endured. Beside her, the foal flicked its ears curiously, still unsteady on its slender legs, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Mrs. Thompson approached slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the straw as she knelt beside them. "Hey there, sweet girl," she whispered, gently stroking Bella's neck. The mare lifted her head, meeting her gaze with deep, wise eyes that always seemed to understand more than words could convey. "Everything's going to be all right, you hear me? We'll take care of you and your baby. No one will harm you again." The foal, who'd been awkwardly exploring the stall, wobbled over to Mrs. Thompson and sniffed her hand as if trying to get to know her. He was small and delicate, but in his movements there was a vitality that reminded Mrs. Thompson of Bella in her youth, so full of life and curiosity. A warm smile spread across her face as she felt something melt inside her chest. For a fleeting moment, she forgot everything that had happened. "Ash," she murmured softly, as if testing the name on her lips. "That's what I'll call you, because you're a gift to us all, a gift we never expected, but one that has brought hope." Gently stroking Ash's soft head, she realized that for the first time in ages, a small spark of joy had emerged amidst the storm. The next morning, the Thompson family gathered around the kitchen table, where the golden light of dawn streamed through the windows, illuminating their tired but resolute faces. They had spent a long night discussing what needed to be done moving forward. Decisions had to be made, and Mrs. Thompson knew she had to be unwavering. There was no room for error now. "We must make sure this never happens again," she declared, her gaze steady as it swept over her husband and children. "I'm going to improve the ranch's security. We'll need taller fences and I'll install more cameras. We can't rely on luck to keep our mares safe." Mr. Thompson nodded, recognizing the gravity of her words. "Whatever you decide, Mucha, you've always known what's best for the animals, and I'll support you." He knew the countless sleepless nights she'd endured worrying about Bella, and he was ready to do whatever it took to help. But security wasn't their only concern. The veterinarian, Dr. Carter, had mentioned that the newborn colt would require special care due to his complicated birth. Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to leave anything to chance. "Aside from reinforcing security, I'll make sure Ash gets the best care possible," she resolved aloud. "I'll ask Dr. Carter to visit more often. I don't care how much it costs. I want to ensure he grows up healthy and strong." Her family responded with nods of agreement. The Thompsons had always prioritized the well-being of their animals above all else, and this time would be no different. Over the following weeks, they dedicated themselves to the stables like never before. Mr. Thompson worked tirelessly to reinforce fences, install new locks, and position cameras at strategic locations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson spent her mornings tending to Bella and Ash, monitoring every small improvement and ensuring the colt was well-fed and nurtured. Those first weeks were tough. Ash was fragile and needed far more attention than most foals. But gradually he grew stronger, running a little farther each day, exploring his small world with the boundless curiosity of his age. The entire family rallied around him, not out of obligation, but because the little colt became a source of joy that helped them all heal. One afternoon, as Mrs. Thompson watched Ash trot around the paddock, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. It was like witnessing something broken come back to life, a flower blooming after a long drought. In that moment, she knew she'd made the right choice by confronting Emily and ensuring she wouldn't return. While the past couldn't be undone, at least she could protect the future. "You're a fighter, Ash," she said aloud as if the colt could understand her. "Just like your mother. And I'll always be here for both of you, to care for you, to protect you." As the days passed, life at the Thompson Ranch slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet Ash's presence added a touch of happiness that hadn't been felt in a long time. Each morning, Mrs. Thompson rose early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and made her way to the stables. There she was greeted by Bella's gentle whinnies and Ash's playful antics. Despite everything they had endured, she found solace in those quiet moments, in the sound of hooves on the earth, the scent of hay in the air, and the sweetness in her mare's trusting eyes. One crisp October afternoon, while Mrs. Thompson was brushing Bella beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, the faint sound of a wagon approached from the distance. She looked up to see Henry walking toward her, his expression serious, yet calm. It had been weeks since their last meaningful conversation. Though they hadn't avoided each other entirely, their exchanges had been brief and perfunctory. Still, Mrs. Thompson knew he had been fulfilling his side of their agreement. Storm remained in his stable, and Henry had ensured no further incidents occurred. "Good afternoon, Henry," she greeted him, setting the brush aside. "Is everything all right?" Henry nodded, though a hint of discomfort shadowed his face. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Thompson," he replied. "I just wanted to talk, if you don't mind." Removing her work gloves, Mrs. Thompson inclined her head. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Henry took a deep breath, as though gathering his thoughts carefully. "First, I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything. I know the situation with Claire was complicated, and you could have taken a much harsher route, but you didn't. I want you to know I appreciate that, and I'm truly sorry for everything that happened." Mrs. Thompson listened quietly, nodding occasionally. She had spent many sleepless nights reflecting on her decision not to take legal action against Claire. In the end, she had chosen to move forward, hoping to prevent any further harm while ensuring such issues wouldn't arise again. "I appreciate your words, Henry," she said after a pause, her tone measured. "I hope Claire is doing well, but we need to be clear about something." "I understand," Henry interrupted gently, "and I promise you, Storm will not come near Bella unless you expressly allow it." He hesitated, clearly grappling with his next words. "But I also wanted to talk to you about Storm. I know he's part of the reason things became so difficult, and I know he must remind you of everything that happened. But please believe me when I say it was never my intention for him to cause trouble. Storm means a great deal to me." Mrs. Thompson studied him, seeing the genuine struggle behind his eyes. She knew Storm bore no blame for what had transpired. Despite the challenges, the horse deserved care and compassion. "Henry, I hold no resentment towards Storm," she said softly. "All I want is for him to be well cared for, not to suffer because of choices others made. If you're willing to ensure that, I believe we can find a way to move forward without further conflict." From there, the conversation unfolded with greater ease. They discussed Storm's needs in detail, and Henry promised to monitor him closely, ensuring he wouldn't wander near the Thompson mares without explicit permission. They even agreed to share responsibilities for any additional care Storm required. As a gesture of goodwill, Henry offered to help around the farm whenever needed, expressing his gratitude for Mrs. Thompson's patience. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Henry and the Thompsons began to mend. While the deep trust of the past hadn't fully returned, a newfound sense of mutual respect and understanding emerged. Henry started spending more time at the farm, assisting with minor chores and occasionally bringing small tokens of appreciation, homemade pies or freshly baked bread, as if to make amends for the past through these thoughtful gestures. Mrs. Thompson accepted his kindness without much comment, but deep down she recognized and valued his efforts. Henry hadn't been the direct cause of the problems, yet he fully understood their weight and was determined to prove he could contribute positively to their lives instead of being a source of strife. As October's brisk air swept across the Thompson farm, carrying the scent of pumpkins and dried leaves, A festive energy settled over the land. It was Halloween Eve, and Mrs. Thompson decided the occasion was perfect for a gathering. Not only to celebrate the season, but also to formally introduce Ash, the cheerful new addition to her family. For days she had been preparing the farm for the event. Twinkling string lights now adorned the barn, casting a warm glow over the yard. Garlands of dried flowers hung in graceful loops, and pumpkins of every size were scattered artfully throughout the space. Some had been carved into whimsical, grinning faces that seemed to keep watch over the festivities. A long table stood to one side, adorned with colorful tablecloths and vases of seasonal flowers, ready to welcome guests with hot coffee, pumpkin pie, and other beloved American treats. Everything was set for the occasion. That afternoon, as she added the finishing touches, Mrs. Thompson paused for a moment to admire her work. "It looks beautiful," she thought, a warm smile spreading across her face. But more importantly, this small gathering wasn't just for her friends, it was for Bella and Ash as well. After all they had endured, they deserved a moment of joy, surrounded by love and companionship. The first arrivals were longtime neighbors, people who had known Bella since she was just a filly, and were delighted to see that despite everything, the farm had endured. Mrs. Thompson, called Mrs. Rodriguez, approaching with a basket of homemade cornbread to share. "And Bella, look at her. She's glowing. She looks just like she did in her prime." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes softening as she glanced toward Bella grazing near the corral, Ash frolicking by her side. "Yes, she's better than ever," she replied, her voice tinged with pride. "And that little one over there," she said, pointing to Ash, who was happily playing among some scattered pumpkins. "She's the reason Bella has found happiness again." As evening fell, the farm came alive with laughter, animated conversations, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Guests gathered around a fire pit that Mr. Thompson had prepared in the yard, sharing stories and memories, while others wandered through the stable to get a closer look at Ash. At first shy, the young foal soon grew comfortable with the attention, approaching people with curious sniffs and flicks of her ears. "She's stunning, Mrs. Thompson," remarked a young woman visiting the farm for the first time. "Is she Bella's foal? I've never seen one quite so special." "Yes, she's Bella's daughter," Mrs. Thompson said with pride, though her thoughts briefly wandered to all the challenges they'd faced for Ash to enter this world. "But more than that, she's a miracle. She's brought us so much joy and reminds us every day why caring for and protecting our animals is so important." The young woman nodded, continuing to stroke Ash's head as the foal leaned into her touch, clearly relishing the affection. There was something about Ash, a lively, untamed energy that captivated everyone, her playful leaps and bounds radiating a sense of pure, uncontainable joy, as though the world was an endless adventure waiting to be explored. As the night deepened, Mrs. Thompson stepped back for a moment, watching the scene from a distance. The sight of the farm bustling with life, faces glowing in the firelight, and the soft shimmer of string lights around the stable filled her with a deep contentment. It hadn't been an easy journey to this moment, but seeing Bella and Ash together, surrounded by love, she realized it had all been worth it. "Lost in thought, my dear?" Mr. Thompson asked, walking up with 2 mugs of steaming coffee. He handed her one and stood beside her, smiling quietly as he took in the scene. "Just reflecting on everything we've been through," she said, taking a sip of coffee and thinking about how lucky we are. "Despite it all, we're here, and I think we're stronger than ever." Mr. Thompson nodded, and for a moment they stood in silence, savoring the warmth of the night in each other's presence. "You know," he began, "I didn't think we'd ever pull through all that mess. But you, stubborn as you are, you made it happen." Mrs. Thompson chuckled softly. "It wasn't just me. It was Bella. It was Ash. And it was all of us deciding together that we were going to make it through." She glanced back at the corral where Ash now playfully romped under Bella's watchful gaze. As the evening wound down, the guests gradually took their leave, expressing gratitude to the Thompsons for the wonderful evening. Yet as the last car pulled away down the driveway, Mrs. Thompson knew this wasn't just a celebration. It was a new chapter for the farm, a symbol that after every storm there was a chance to rebuild, to find peace, and to rediscover happiness. In the days that followed, Mrs. Thompson gathered her family to share an idea that had been quietly forming in her mind for some time. Opening the farm to the public would allow more people to meet Bella and Ash while learning about the importance of compassion and respect for animals. We could offer guided tours, teach children how to care for horses, and maybe, just maybe, help people understand why what we do here matters so much, she explained with hope. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon plans were underway to transform the space into a welcoming haven for visitors. Once a quiet retreat nestled within the community, the Thompson farm was now becoming a beacon of hope and education. It evolved into a place where stories of struggle and perseverance were woven into life lessons for everyone who came to listen. With Ash galloping freely through the fields and Bella watching her with eyes full of love, the farm found a renewed purpose. Sometimes blessings come in unexpected forms, requiring only patience, an open heart, and unwavering determination to recognize them. The tale of Bella and Ash at the Thompson farm is a moving journey of resilience, love, and unyielding dedication. Throughout the narrative, Mrs. Thompson faces unforeseen challenges and moments of doubt, but her steadfast resolve to protect those she loves never falters. The arrival of difficulties brings with it new light and hope, breathing fresh life into the farm. This story emphasizes the profound value of empathy and care for animals, showing us that they are not mere companions or tools, but cherished members of a family deserving of love and respect. Moreover, the mended relationship between the Thompson family and Henry illustrates the transformative power of forgiveness and teamwork. It demonstrates that even in the most trying circumstances, there is room for understanding and reconciliation. The story's deepest lesson is that love and dedication can triumph over even the greatest hardships. What may seem like an obstacle can become a blessing in disguise when met with a willingness to persevere and cherish what truly matters. This story is not only heartwarming, but also a reminder of the importance of protecting animals and building strong, loving relationships between humans and our animal companions. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel to follow more heartwarming and meaningful videos. Be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss any incredible stories in the future. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to continuing this journey with you in the next video.